Hi, my name is Bill McCamley, and welcome to What the Bleep Does This Mean? A podcast where we try to talk about a fairly complicated thing happening in the public in 15 minutes or less in hopefully language you can understand. And today we're going to talk about militarizing the border. So, this last week, various news organizations reported that national Republicans plan to turn the entire border with Mexico and the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and California into a military base. No, that is not a joke or an overstatement, and as someone living down here, it is really concerning for a whole host of reasons. The borderland has some pretty interesting history. A dispute between Mexico and the U.S. over the Mesilla Valley, where I live in a town called Las Cruces, New Mexico, was a reason that the U.S. paid $10 million in the early 1850s for what is now the border between New Mexico, and Arizona, which is also important because the Rio Grande River would sometimes change course before it was dammed up and controlled, leading some towns to actually change countries after a flood. But since around 1920, there haven't been any real issues between the countries other than disputes over water. This is the desert, and there's an old saying out west: whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting over. But in fact, for the last 30 years or so, our economies have become really connected as trade increased. Laredo and El Paso in Texas, Santa Teresa here in New Mexico, Nogales in Arizona, and the San Diego area in California all help Americans get good jobs in trade and help lower priced goods be sold in the States for food like cattle and manufactured goods for things like cars, airplanes, and windmills that generate electricity. And despite fear mongering from people like Donald Trump, those of us that live close to the border have generally felt pretty safe. I mean, I literally grew up surrounded by farm fields where migrant workers were common all the time. It was never an issue. When I went to New Mexico State University, it was super common for students to go down to Juarez, they called it J-Town, where the drinking age is 18. And the biggest danger was actually just getting your nose broken. Pat, if you're listening, you know who you are, or driving when you were wasted. Hell, El Paso, right down the way, was ranked this year number one for the safest major city in the country, even though it's right on the border. However, because of worries about us in other parts of the country, there are special rules down here. A big example of this is inland border patrol stations. Most people don't know this, but a Supreme Court case in the 70s said that the US government could set up permanent checkpoints on highways and stop everyone who drives through within about 100 miles of the border. They said that the US Constitution's protections set up against reasonable searches and seizures in the Fourth Amendment didn't quite apply to us because of the necessity to check for things like smuggling. So anyone living in border towns are actually landlocked. In order for me to go to a place like Albuquerque, Tucson, or Austin, I have to pass through these checks and answer questions from the Border Patrol. This becomes more than an academic issue sometimes for a couple examples. For instance, when I was a state representative, I had a constituent who was a cancer patient and was part of the state's legal medical cannabis program. She was adamant that the cannabis was a lifesaver, that the chemo she was on killed her appetite, and the only way she would want to eat was by smoking cannabis. However, it's still illegal under federal law, and while some agents would let her go through, others took her medicine when she had to go up to Albuquerque to get treatment at the cancer center up there. A month ago, a bus carrying the Las Cruces High School swim team was stopped at one of these checkpoints, boarded, and an agent started screaming at the students in Spanish to produce papers, even though teachers tried really hard to explain, hey, look, fellas, everyone here speaks English, and these are just kids going to the state championships. This new proposal, though, to turn the border into a military base is a whole different kettle of fish. Project 2025, which many of you may have heard of, is the Trump and Republican administration's playbook for how radical conservatives want to change America. In addition to turning schools over to corporations and churches, banning abortion everywhere, and making school librarians sex offenders if they have a book with a gay character, and yes, that is a real thing, it calls for complete militarization of the border. Now, this has sort of been done before and fairly recently. At various times, Bush, Obama, and Biden and Trump have sent some U.S. military personnel to the border to help with targeted operations. But they've always been limited because of a law called the Posse Comitatus Act. Posse Comitatus is Latin and means power of the country. You may have heard the term posse be used through American history, especially out here in the West, to describe groups of citizens put together temporarily by a local police chief or sheriff to enforce a law. One of the most famous examples of this is in the movie Tombstone, where the gambler, Doc Holliday, was deputized by Virgil Earp, who was recognized as a federal marshal, to pursue what became the gunfight at the OK Corral. But romanticism and stories aside, the law we're talking about was passed in 1878 in a period of American history known as Reconstruction. See, after the Civil War, Northern troops were left full time in Southern states to enforce new laws that banned slavery. After a few years, though, white Southerners started regaining power in the South, and this law was passed in Congress because they didn't want the federal government keeping the Army in Southern states to stop segregation and other types of Jim Crow laws forcing Black people to be second-hand citizens. Now, this story doesn't exactly cover America in glory, but with that being said, it does reinforce a key reason we rebelled against the British in the 1700s. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it was passed because the dudes who wrote it felt it was super important to specifically spell out the rights all Americans should have. We all know about the First Amendment with freedom of speech, and I'm sure you've heard about the Second Amendment regarding gun rights. But did you know about the Third Amendment to the Constitution? It says specifically, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quarantined in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. See, before and after before and during the American Revolution, the English king forced American families to house and feed British troops that were sent to enforce laws in American communities like Boston that were getting more and more pissed off at things like high taxes they didn't vote for and being forced to house a pretty large standing army in people's houses. This was seen as such a big deal at the time that state constitutions in Delaware and Virginia made that practice illegal. And then the dudes that wrote the rules for the whole country followed suit. So even though the Posse Comitatus Act was passed for a shitty reason, it reflects a long tradition of Americans not being comfortable with our military being used as police. Since the Civil War, there has been a few times that the Army has been called up to act as cops. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, Marines were called up to help with draft riots in New York. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, which is super good, by the way, the last battle scene is this. During the Great Depression in the early 30s, Herbert Hoover, the then president, brought in tanks to force out and burn camps World War I vets were sleeping in to protest not getting bonus checks to help with the terrible economy. In 1957, President Eisenhower called in the 101st Airborne, my dad's old unit, to enforce desegregation rules in Little Rock, Arkansas, because mobs of white folks didn't want black kids going to traditionally white schools. Troops were called in the 1960s to deal with a lot of race riots, the most serious being after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, when almost every major city with black populations rioted. And then when Rodney King, a black man, was beaten within inches of his life by white Los Angeles policemen, many folks rioted over 32 square miles of Los Angeles, and some federal troops were called in to help local police and National Guard troops help quell the riots. The last example brings up a good point. Posse Comitatus only applies directly to federal troops. Until the U.S. government declares war on a foreign country, National Guard units are run by individual states and are called up pretty regularly to help with all sorts of state-level emergencies like distributing vaccines during COVID or helping with responses to hurricanes and wildfires. And it is really important to note, all of these things where the Army was called up in the past were temporary missions. Troops were called off when the direct emergency was over. So how does all this relate to this border thing we're talking about today? When federal troops were called up in the past few years, because of the restriction placed on them by this law, they could only observe when they thought something was suspicious and report it to civilian law enforcement agencies responsible for border security, who would then arrest the folks or seize drugs if they were there. Basically, they stood out there with binoculars, and when they saw something, they'd call someone else to go investigate. The military does have responsibility, though, for policing their own military bases. So theoretically, If the federal government declares the entire border a military base, military troops could do the things we're now asking people like the Customs Office and Border Patrol to do. Now, let's be very, very clear. Cartel activity does come across the border from Mexico to the US. The shit they do, like run drugs and smuggle humans, is a serious problem. But there are three reasons why making the Army a permanent police force where I live could be a problem. First is it probably won't actually do that much. You might assume that there are a ton of people and drugs coming across the border in the middle of the desert, but that just isn't true. Let's take fentanyl, for instance. It's a painkiller that is used by a lot of drug users to increase the high they get from opiates like heroin. It is bad, bad shit, and a ton of people OD on it. And most of it comes from Mexico. But here's the thing. Almost all of it crosses at already established border checkpoints because cartels have gotten super good at hiding it in otherwise legitimate trade goods, or mislabeling crates, or using front companies, or bringing them by ships at seaports that are registered to other countries. So a few thousand troops running around in the middle of the desert won't actually do much good in stopping fentanyl. Second is opportunity cost. If you're not familiar with that term, it means you only have so much of something, and using it in one place means you can't use it somewhere else. If you call up significant military resources for this border role, where again, it probably won't do very much, it is A, really, really fucking expensive. And B, means they are not available to respond if countries around the globe get frisky and threaten US interests in other places where the military might actually do some good. So are guys like Putin happy when the US military is busy camping out in New Mexico? Probably, yeah. And number three, speaking of Putin, there is a much larger, scarier issue here. As we have talked about, Americans have always been super hesitant to use troops as cops. And since the end of the 1860s, anytime we've called up those troops, it's been for that short period of time for a very specific emergency. But dictators love using their military on their own people because they don't really care about things like civil rights for their citizens as long as they can do whatever they want to stay in power. Russia actually has a whole group of their military they call internal troops, at least until 2016, and it's now being labeled as a National Guard. But unlike our National Guard, it's not a part-time thing. They are military units with tanks, artillery, and armored helicopters, and they have the right to shoot without warning and enter private homes inside Russia anytime they want. For me, I like living in a country where we protect rights and freedoms, and that generally means not using military troops and weapons for things happening here. As someone who lives near the border, yeah, it scares me a bit that this could now be a permanent thing. So I'm going to be watching how this plays out really carefully. But even if you don't live near the border, the way dictators gain power is they chip away at things like individual guaranteed rights and freedoms bit by bit. So if someone like Trump is allowed to call up the army in the US on a permanent basis, in spite of almost 2 centuries of not doing this, the chances that it stops here are pretty small. Thomas Jefferson, the dude that wrote the Declaration of Independence, in part because the English king at the time was using the army against his own citizens, had a saying, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." I would ask those of us in America to stay vigilant when things like this start to happen, because the chance they can infringe on our liberty and freedom over time become bigger and bigger. Thanks very much for listening to this. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, or other input, please comment on the social media stream that you might find this on, or you can email me at whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. That's whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening to this, y'all. I appreciate it and hope everyone has a great day. Y'all keep your heads up out there.